what my father realized back in the 1960s is that the reason that people pay us and the reason that we pay other people is to solve a problem. And it doesn't matter whether the problem is a dirty floor or a complex market entry strategy or a compelling piece of video that you're trying to put together. It's a set of problems to be solved. Now, we know in every organization there's one or two people who think it's their job to create problems, and you know exactly who they are. But for the most part, we're supposed to be problem solvers. And so if you think of yourself as a problem solver, and again, my father defined this in Parachute, when you approach somebody to potentially allow you to do work with them, you're solving a problem. And if you can articulate it in the context of the way they see the problem, you are far more likely to get hired than anybody else.
Hello and welcome to Coffee with Mr. IoT. My name is Robert Schmidt. I am Deloitte's Chief Futurist, also known as Mr. IoT. And today on my show we have Gary Bolles. And Gary, I looked at your LinkedIn, I looked at some of your things, and I don't know which one to pick out of as your title or what you do. I wanted to give it to you. How do you describe yourself?
Well, I make it deliberately confusing because I have an advanced case of adult attention deficit, and so
I was more impressed, not confused. But
good. Impression is good. That's I sort of say I have three hats which I spin constantly. So I'm the chair for the future of work with Singularity University, which is sort of a learning and think tank group based now in Santa Clara, California. I have a company, small consulting company called Charette, and focus on strategies for the future of work, the future of learning, and the future of the organization. And because there's just not enough time in the day, I've got a small software company called eParachute, which is built off of the intellectual property of a book called What Color is Your Parachute, which is sort of the world's enduring career manual. So with Singularity, I've got sort of the macro view of change, especially in the context of the future of work. With Charette, we sort of dive in with a range of different people all over the world, focused on trying to transition their organizations and their communities. And then with eParachute, I kind of have seen how people change careers and the ways to be able to help them do that most effectively.
One of the things, I said you have a lot of things, I feel sometimes similar, and when people ask me what's your passion, I always think all things digital. If I'd ask you, what's your passion, what would that be?
It's sort of, if you distill all those things down, it's helping individuals to be, people, humans, to be able to continually navigate disruptive change. That's really it, is if you sort of put all those threads together, we're in one of the most amazing times in human history, where the pace of change seems to be accelerating even faster and faster. We're more and more connected. And so that creates tremendous change and tremendous opportunity. And as humans, we're probably not exactly designed to be able to navigate all that change as rapidly as we might, and as certainly as effectively as we might. And so I think that's the deliverable. How do we help people to continue to thrive?
One of the things, so by the way, what I found fascinating is you didn't mention this, but some of the stuff you said is based on a book your dad wrote, is that correct?
Yeah, so it's so funny, we should be taping here in San Francisco at the intersection of Geary and Taylor Street. I actually grew up in San Francisco. My parents split up when I was a teenager, and my father was a minister at Grace Cathedral, which is at the top of the hill above us, Episcopalian Cathedral. And he was a minister, he was canon pastor, and his favorite joke at the time was, well, what do you do with a canon? You fire it. So they laid him off because of a budget crunch after 2 years. And here's this minister, he's in his 40s, he's going through divorce, he's got 4 kids, and eventually found a job helping other ministers who are on college campuses, and they were getting laid off. So he spent a year on a grant from Lilly just researching what are the best techniques in the late 1960s to find jobs, and there weren't many. So he ended up writing a self-published book, and he called it What Color is Your Parachute, from an old parable that he used to tell. And as a kid, literally as a teenager, I would walk past this hotel down to the post office with his self-published books, and I would say to him, why are people ordering books for ministers? It's Department of Labor, it's corporations. And he said, I don't know. He would ask them, and they would say it's the best compendium on the market. And so, sensing a market opportunity, he rewrote the book. He was actually living 2 blocks from here at 627 Taylor Street, and rewrote it for the common person, found a publisher, 10 Speed Press, And as they say, the rest is history. 10 million copies in print, 17 different languages. I was actually trained in his methods when I was 19. I never spent much time in college, so that was a thing to do. And my father passed away 2 years ago, so but he had an amazing legacy. And so I see a lot of the things that we're doing is helping to sort of build on a lot of the insights he got into helping individuals to be able to navigate changes in their careers and then figure out, well, how do you put all that against the landscape of disruptive change?
Yeah, I was going to ask you exactly this question, right? That book was written how many years ago, 40?
So it was first written in 1970, well, first for the general purpose in 1970, but my father rewrote at least part of it every year for 42 years. And so his favorite joke was he'd written 42 different books that just all had the same title because he adapted it continually for the times. So for instance, during the Great Recession, he wrote an edition called the Hard Times Edition. And it was much more about survival job hunting. It wasn't so much about what you really would love to do, which is to take more time to understand your own skills and to figure out all the different places you could use them. It was much more about you need work tomorrow. So how do you do that? And so he was continually adapting for the times and building on his own insights and strategies to be able to make them as relevant as possible.
So I have two boys.
How old?
One 20 and 22.
Mine's 23.
Oh, okay. And so one of the things that I think about is, I contrast, I went to school and then I went to university and it was sort of like, it was a very competitive time. I played hockey. I was very competitive. I joined the job that I wanted. There was sort of like, much of my...
You were driven.
Yes, and much of sort of like, it's interesting today because much of what my personal self-worth was tied to how hard I work and what I accomplish and my impact and so forth. And so now I think of my kids and I wonder what are they gonna do. So how would you compare, not me, but sort of like 30 years ago to today, what are my kids gonna look for? How's that gonna go compared to back then?
That's a great question. So I often talk about the old rules of work and the new rules of work. And so what were the old rules of work? My father, after he wrote Parachute, he realized, well, he'd focused a lot on the work-related issues, but people were more than just work. As a matter of fact, you had learning, and then later on, after you're done working, you have this big chunk of leisure. And so he actually wrote a book called The 3 Boxes of Life, and I think this is very relevant to your kids. So my father's thesis was we have this big chunk of learning at the beginning of our lives because we come out of the womb. As I always say, nobody gave you the user manual of you. You get.
I'm still looking for it, by the way.
Yeah. So you buy a digital distraction device, an iPhone. It has a user manual. It says what it's good for and what it's not. But you come out of the womb and you're in the hospital, and nobody gives your parents the user manual that you'll be learning from. So we become a trial and error machines. Unfortunately, what we did in the shift from agricultural to industrial economies is we built these things called schools, and we built them on a model of mass production. So how do you get a whole bunch of students to learn from a very small number of teachers and move them as cohorts so that they are actually able to work in factories? And that's the system that we've inherited. And then, so my father said, okay, you have this big chunk of education, then you got this big chunk of work with a completely different set of rules from the education box. Nobody prepared you for that. And then when you're too old to enjoy it, you have this period I call the period formerly known as retirement, this big chunk of leisure. So 3 boxes of life: education, work, and leisure. And what he said in the book 3 Boxes, which is out of print, but you can still get it on Amazon, was why are we intentional about lifelong learning, lifelong work, and lifelong leisure? And why don't we actually put all those together? So I show, when I lecture about this, I show a picture, 3 boxes, and then I say, what is it now? What's the model that your kids and my kid are coming into? Well, sure, I went to school, and then maybe I went to college, but maybe I stopped out and I took a gap year, and that's leisure. And then I got a job, so that's work, but then I'm also learning online, and then I'm working on a startup with my friends, and I'm driving for Uber. So I show this mishmash of boxes, and then I say, that is a portfolio of work. That's what our kids are coming into. They're coming in a world where they will continually need to make it up. They can be much more intentional. The way that so many markets are transitioning, there's a low friction to entry into many markets. So that means that they can jump into a whole bunch of different things and actually have a range of different projects simultaneously. What we don't do is we don't train them for that. The old rules of work were one person, one job, go into the right school, learn the right field, get the right job, and all of that meant that you would be able to amortize that education investment through your life. And now it's got to be lifelong learning, lifelong work, and lifelong leisure, because if we're not intentional about those things, the shelf life for those knowledges we gathered in school is just getting shorter and shorter.
So I'm always curious what that means to you personally when you say, I get the portfolio of work. We talked about this. What's your lifelong learning and what's your lifelong leisure today?
Wonderful question. So when I say you've got to be intentional, so first off, work will eat you alive. Because we all have these digital distraction devices, we're available 24/7 and even more.
You're not much on Twitter, are you?
Don't do Twitter. LinkedIn. I've got 9 courses on LinkedIn, and I spend a lot of time. That's really where I think a lot of the interaction that I get that is really rewarding to me. So, to me, the opportunity is where if you are perpetually curious, which is I used to think of as one of my liabilities, and now I'm gradually deciding it's an asset. If you're perpetually curious, if there's always, I find there isn't a dinner conversation that I can have with people that I've never met before where I can't find something that is just so deeply fascinating to me because I know nothing about it. And so if you work from that assumption that there's this massive amount of things to learn in the world and you really don't know, you know a tiny percentage of it. So if you're intensely curious, then the portfolio of work, if you can have some of the other things that you need, the transferable skills and other things that allow you to be able to do it, if you can manage that, then that gives you tremendous variability, a lot of variety in a given day. It gives you tremendous opportunity, but it also has precarity. It's a fever chart. It's not a flat paycheck, and it has a lot of risks associated with it. So for me, if you're intentional, then what you're doing is say, okay, so first thing is you want to stay perpetually curious so you can learn under any circumstances. You've got to actually be intentional about that. So that's why I go to a lot of conferences. It's actually why I do a lot of lectures, because I also get to meet a bunch of amazing people. And then the leisure, it's really, really critical to actually block out time to, especially with family, and especially when your kids are younger, because this is such a rapidly changing world. They need help in continually processing things that actually probably didn't need quite as much help in the past. And so put all those together, what ends up happening then, because my wife and I also work together as well as raised our son, we are much more intentional about actually blocking out those times to go do fun things together. And then also what ends up happening, I find in a portfolio of work, is that the lines blur. So we produce a lot of events, strategic conferences. Are you learning? Are you working? Are you having fun meeting people? Yes. So it sort of blurs the lines between those things. But again, you have to be intentional and turn off the work part on a regular basis, or else it'll just continually dominate your life.
I think a big part of me doing this here is about me being curious. It gets me this opportunity to ask questions, have a one-on-one conversation, so it really plays into that.
That's great.
I'm curious, I watched one of your YouTubes and you talk about pace. Okay. The 4 skills you think people need today. Can you just explain to us what is pace? And I loved some of those. That was really interesting. I thought there was some interesting stuff in there.
So there's all sorts of, I'll back up really quickly. So there's 2 kinds of skills going way, way back to research in the 1950s as the US transitioned from a war footing to a consumer economy. And basically, it's information that is sort of anchored or rooted in an arena. So the example I use is if you're, brain surgery, it doesn't help you to fix a car engine, or hopefully vice versa. So those are anchored in a space. So they're not transferable. And that's actually what our school systems are designed for, is to shove a whole bunch of knowledge into our heads that we can then amortize throughout that work box. Well, as more and more information becomes,
did your son go to college? I'm curious.
He did, actually. He got an archaeology degree, so of course he's financially set for life, and so so he is an amazing writer. He's a phenomenal communicator. He's fascinated by a range of different things. I think he'll be a documentarian. I think he'll be a science communicator. I think he'll be an investigative reporter like my uncle was. I think he will have so many different places he can go. It's actually more of set of choices he'll have to make at any one time than a limited set of options. So my wife wouldn't allow me to tell him I didn't go to college until he'd already decided. So,
I was just curious because you talk about education, so I.
Absolutely. No, I have no. I wrote a long piece on unbundling higher education. I lecture at colleges all the time. You would think I have no moral footing to talk about the future of especially higher education. So, but that's the world we live in. So to continue with pace, so that we got these knowledges that are anchored or rooted in a particular arena, and then you've got these transferable skills usable in a range of different situations. So if you, when you were 5 years old, it was your bedtime, and you went to go try to convince your parents to let you stay up late, and they did, suddenly you're good at persuading or convincing, and you might become a salesman or, God forbid, a politician. Or so you've learned these transferable skills usable in a range of different situations. What we've done is we've designed schools to teach those special knowledges, that information anchored in a space. But in a world where we have access to the world's information in our digital distraction devices, then it's really those transferable skills usable in all sorts of different situations we need to train for more. So there's all sorts of models. And by the way, we call these hard skills and these soft skills, right? So which is not exactly accurate. And so, but there's a lot of models nowadays. Different people say the different, prioritizing of different types of transferable skills and that sort of thing. The reason I picked PACE is, I'll tell you the four and then I'll tell you the rationale. Problem solvers who are adaptive, creative, and have empathy. So why would you pick those four? When there's all these other skills, collaboration and critical thinking and so on. So because I talk so much about the exponential pace of change, especially through Singularity University, what my father realized back in the 1960s is that the reason that people pay us and the reason that we pay other people is to solve a problem. And it doesn't matter whether the problem is a dirty floor or a complex market entry strategy or a compelling piece of video that you're trying to put together. It's a set of problems to be solved. Now, we know in every organization there's one or two people who think it's their job to create problems, and you know exactly who they are. But for the most part, we're supposed to be problem solvers. And so if you think of yourself as a problem solver, and again, my father defined this in Parachute, when you approach somebody to potentially allow you to do work with them, you're solving a problem. And if you can articulate it in the context of the way they see the problem, you are far more likely to get hired than anybody else. So problem solvers, and then adaptive. Well, we talk at Singularity University, Ray Kurzweil is very fond of talking about exponential change, these curves that you keep seeing over and over again.
You made them straight now, actually, which is really confusing for people. Because like this line is exponential and now it's a straight line.
Yeah, well, so just as long as it keeps going really fast to the upper right, you're all fine.
Yeah, I know.
So the joke at Singularity University is this is the slowest day of the rest of your life. Like the pace, it's still going up, exponential or linear, doesn't matter.
Okay, one more time. It's the slowest day
of the rest of your life. So it's only going to be faster. So you're going to be telling your kids, I remember when we didn't have a phone jacked into our heads. And it's always going to be like that, right? It's always going to be like that. And so if the pace of change is accelerating, then what do we need? We need to develop adaptive skills, because I can't tell you.
What's an adaptive skill? Help me with that. I'm really curious what that means to you.
All right, so there's a whole set of theories around this, and it's very rooted. It needs to be rooted in psychology, because as humans, if you just sort of think of the way we sort of developed as an organism, I mean, we are not that far on an evolutionary scale from a time when we basically looked across the savannah and we saw something moving and we tried to decide, is that my lunch or am I its lunch, right? Yeah. And so that's a lot of our senses. We're sort of in our psychology, we're sort of designed for a certain level of complexity and sets of problems to be able to respond to. And in a world of exponential change, adaptive skills would start to look like things like a growth mindset. So Carol Dweck, the psychologist, is fond of talking about a fixed versus a growth mindset. If you've got a fixed mindset, you liked yesterday, today's pretty good, and you want tomorrow to be just like today, then you kind of don't want that change, right? But if you have an adaptive mindset or your growth mindset, you're a growing, changing person, and if you're constantly curious, then you're going to embrace the next thing that's going to come as a chance to solve new problems. So it doesn't mean that you can't still have a fixed mindset, or that's not even a good thing. If you're following the old rules of work and you just are doing your job and feeding your family and putting a roof over their heads, that's just fine. There's just going to be less and less work like that as time goes on.
Okay.
So adaptive skills are things like being able to collaborate with others. It's being able to have foresight, or at least understanding trends, to be able to start to have your own opinion about how things are changing. Being able to embrace certain changes, not all. Some static things like strong values are good. but basically being able to continually see yourself as that person who is changing over time. Now, if you anchor yourself in a field, like I'm a lawyer or I'm a doctor, and suddenly you lose that job, and now you're using your skills that you used as a lawyer in a completely new context, but your identity is anchored back in that old structure, then you're going to find it much, much harder to adapt. Okay, then finally, creative, because that's what keeps us ahead of robots and software. Repetitive tasks, that's the AI and robots arena. And then finally, empathy. So I talk about empathy a lot because it turns out that if you're solving a problem, and especially if you're solving it for a person, understanding deeply what that problem is, if you follow the precepts of design thinking or anything like that, the deeper empathy that you can have for the person, the better you're going to help to construct or work with them to construct solutions. And so you can pick your own 4 transferable skills, doesn't have to be PACE, but the basic premise is that you assemble these together, and it turns out those are the successful characteristics of an entrepreneur. Those are the successful characteristics of somebody who can collaborate well with others. Continually being a problem solver is adaptive, creative, and has empathy allows you to be able to continually approach new problems with new kinds of thinking.
So I want to close with a question, and let me put it into context how I feel, and maybe this helps others too. It's a little bit about impact and a little bit about what matters. I think I mentioned this before, that a lot of my self-worth is in sort of accomplishment, impact, how hard did I work? And I've been trying lately, sort of like I became the CIO of a public company when I was in my middle to late 40s. I sort of like, wow, I did it. And then I sort of like stood there and thought, I don't feel like I'm having the impact anymore I want. And then I shifted, and I sort of had to really rewire myself. And I still think I'm in this. How do you help people measure impact? How do you help people to measure their own impact and measure the impact they make around that? And I know you talk about impact a lot, so I thought it's an interesting question. We have impact a lot in Deloitte as one of our, we have an impact day, for example, that we do once a year. And so I'm curious, because I know you talked about measuring impact, and I'm curious what you think about that.
So it's
and maybe it helps me too in that.
It's very top of mind. I just recorded 5 courses for Pluralsight on impact, on having an impact, scaling impact, and so on. And so I'll just tell you some of the brief pieces. So the first is, if you study sort of the Japanese mentality of ikigai, the sort of 4th part of the decision-making process, from what you can get paid for, what you're good at, what you love doing, the 4th step is what the world needs. And so when I show that as a stack, say the old rules of work where you sort of added what the world needs at the end. And increasingly what you're seeing with young people is they flip the stack. They come in saying, what does the world need? And then, can I do that? Can I make money at it? And so on. And so what we learned going back to the mid-2000s was that a lot of the skills that I'd sort of developed from being a recovering journalist, from being an entrepreneur and so on, we know how to convene people, we know how to use content, and we knew how to build consortia. And so what we found was we started something called SOCAP, Social Capital Markets, which is basically brings entrepreneurs together with people who have capital and helps them to build businesses with a purpose. And so we built this whole thesis about what impact is and what drives you, what you feel is your reason for being on the planet. And so I first urge people to be able to step back and say, if you could remove all constraints, what are the issues in the world you care about the most? And if you could wave a magic wand, and you didn't have to be the one to do it, but what would be the changes you most see? What are the top priorities that you think need to be changed in the world? Now, what would you do, even with the smallest step you could take? But then, because we talk at Singularity so much about moonshots and 10xing, how could you then take that thing that you care so much about and actually expand your impact and do it in a way where actually you are paid and you do use skills that you love and you're good at? And so we've applied that over and over again in a range of different situations. And so much of our focus now is on the future of work, because we think this is such an incredibly pivotal time for so many people who will need to develop those adaptive skills to be able to be successful in the future. And so if you're thinking about impact, if someone is thinking about sort of that process, I'd say it's always great to start small, make sure you understand the thing that you most care about. And it's wonderful if you're going to volunteer with a nonprofit or help people in your community. But how can you then take all the skills and all the things that you've developed, and what are the ways you can actually meld that with the impact you want in the world and the ways that you could scale that? And I always tell people, start first by finding something that's already addressing those issues. Can you amplify it? If you're an entrepreneur and you're meant to start something, well, then how do you start something that's sustainable? Because if you're a nonprofit, you're on 100% life support. If you're a for-profit, then there's a profit motive, but there's a cost of doing good. You need to balance all of those different elements. But I always urge people to figure out how can you bake that impact into what you do on a daily basis. And then there's two questions I always ask people to ask. So the first is, in 10 years, what will you wish you had done today? And with Dan Kahneman's sort of thinking fast and slow, that's the thinking fast thing. Like, you probably already know the 2 or 3 things you should be doing today to get some kind of result. And then the second question is, if you're successful, how would you know? What are the ways you would measure what you got to? And that's the way to start baking in that measurement, understanding the kinds of things you're looking for the change you want to see when you start today.
So I said it was my last question, and now I have another one, obviously, because you sparked my thinking. So if I take this, and I'd love to apply it to something real, can we do that?
Yeah, please.
So if I think of my work with Internet of Things, IoT, I talk a lot about predictive machines. Mm-hmm. And what fascinates me is, and what sort of always baffles me is, we talk about predicting machine failure, but we're not talking about predicting human health.
Right.
There's something missing around predicting human health for me. And it's sort of like, I'm passionate about it, but it feels so freaking huge. Mm-hmm. How would we apply it to that passion you're thinking from before?
So first I look at intersections, right? So because, again, going back to my father's work, what you find is once you understand your own unique skills, knowledge is the things that you most love to do, then you're looking, that's sort of the what part. And then the where is what are all the different scenarios where you could use those skills. And increasingly where I think a lot of the opportunity for humans is going to be in the future is intersection of things, right? So the nodes of the network, the intersection nodes of the network, and the super nodes. And so I've got a long-time networking background from running magazines like Network Computing, so I can talk the talk. So if you think of those intersections, then you say, okay, so I understand networks, and I understand a lot of the ways that you can think about how devices communicating with each other, and especially having more and more information to be able to predict failures and so on, how that can actually drive better outcomes, right? There's some more resilient systems, faster computing and so on. Now, there are people who are really, really smart about the human system, and we're getting smarter and smarter, faster and faster as we continue to crack the code on a lot of the reasons why we age and get sick. So I would be thinking about the intersection of those things. How can you take what you know about the way that devices function, and how can somebody who understands the way people function, what are the ways we could actually meld those? And what are some of the quick wins? Like, that as we instrument ourselves more and more, there's a whole bunch of things we're going to get that are either false positives or information that's actually not quite as useful. So I would be saying, well, where are the opportunities to be able to find people that are trying to deeply knowledgeable, have the special knowledges about the human condition and human health, and the knowledge of the devices, and how can we actually work together? And what's the smallest thing we can do? And I can tell you, there's just so much innovation. If you look at exponential medicine that Daniel Kraft runs at Singularity University, there's so much innovation. I will guarantee you that there are innovators who don't know that realm, and that would be tremendous help for. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's the way I think about those things.
So if I put it in my words, it's about looking at people that intersect that in different networks and try to connect them, find the intersection between them, see overlapping things that help each other and so forth around this.
Correct,
sort of like,
and can amplify each other, solve problems that each other can't solve. Right, because increasingly that's the need. It's going to be specialists in different arenas, all working together collaboratively.
I asked one of my guests on one show, is a doctor, if he could put a sensor anywhere in the body, where he'd put it. Do you have any guess where he said? Intestinal systems, our stomach, our.
I was going to say the output. But I guess, yeah, going to the source probably would be good. So
it was fascinating to me. So that was his spot where he'd put
very interesting
sensor to really predict the most. So.
Yeah, I would say gut biome and that sort of thing. I mean, you'd want a lot of real-time data.
Yeah.
That would be really useful. Exactly. So, awesome.
Well, with that, I want to say thank you for being here. Fascinating conversation. I had 5 more questions in my brain that I had to cut out. And thanks for being here.
No, it's been great.
And with that, this is another Coffee with Mr. IoT coming to an end. Please subscribe up here or down there, depending on what device you're on. And if you missed any previous shows, come back to our playlist. And with that, thank you for watching.